You ever walk by one of those old houses that looks like it belongs more to time than to a person? That was Bob's place. Sat right at the end of East Willow Lane, where the pavement started to crack and the mailboxes leaned like tired old men. His house was the kind you'd miss if you blinked too long. Nothing fancy, just a sagging porch with a wind chime that hadn't chimed since the Reagan administration, and a screen door that creaked like it was telling ghost stories. The paint had long given up trying to hold on, and the yard was the kind that whispered, "No one's been out here in a while." But you know how some places feel like they're waiting for something? That was Bob's house. Now, I don't say that to paint some tragic picture. Bob wasn't miserable. He wasn't out there sobbing on the steps or anything like that. He still made his coffee every morning, still fed the neighbor's cat when it came crying at his window, still yelled at the squirrels like they owed him rent. But underneath all that was quiet. The kind of quiet that presses in on a man's ribs. Bob had outlived nearly everyone he used to share stories with. His wife passed 5 years back. Cancer. He still kept her teacup by the sink. Not washed. Just there, like some part of her still came by now and then for Earl Grey. He used to be someone people knew. Folks would say, "You mean Bob? Bob Harris? The jazz guy?" They'd grin like they just remembered a favorite song. Now? He was the man who shuffled slowly to the mailbox, wearing 2 different shoes, muttering about the price of stamps. Sometimes people waved, sometimes they didn't. But let me tell you something about Bob's house that most folks didn't know. It was once the liveliest corner of the block. Back in the 70s, he and his wife threw these music-filled cookouts. Bob on trumpet, Johnny on drums, barbecue ribs that made grown men cry. People danced on the lawn like the ground was made of rhythm. All that joy, now wrapped in silence. And inside that house, inside Bob, something was beginning to slip, but no one really noticed. Not yet. Here's the thing no one prepares you for. When the days stop having names. Bob woke up most mornings unsure if it was Tuesday or Sunday. It didn't help that every morning felt like a Tuesday, gray, slow, and slightly annoying. He had this clock in the kitchen that told the day of the week. Big bold letters. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The damn thing worked fine, but Bob still asked it out loud, just to make sure. "What are we today, pal? Thursday again? Already?" He'd chuckle at himself, but there was a weight behind the laugh. Most of his days blurred together like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. He'd find his socks in the freezer, pour orange juice in his cereal. One time, he stood in the doorway for 10 minutes, trying to remember if he was going out or coming back in. He gave up and sat on the porch instead, which wasn't a bad compromise. Now, he didn't talk much about the forgetting. Not really. Pride's a funny thing, especially for men who grew up in a time when feelings were what you kept between you and the whiskey bottle. But it was there. He knew something was wrong. He knew his memories had started slipping through the cracks like sand through old fingers. He just didn't know what to do about it. What scared him wasn't the forgetting itself. It was what got lost with it. Like the smell of his wife's hair when she leaned in to kiss him good morning. Or the inside jokes from road tours that spanned 5 states and 3 breakups. Even the names of his old bandmates began to fade. He'd look at a picture, one of them in matching suits, grinning like fools, and try to remember the guy next to him. Jimmy? No. Julian? Wait, was he the one who knocked over the punch bowl at that wedding in Tulsa? He could still remember how the trumpet felt in his hands, the weight of it, the slick press of the valves. But what he couldn't remember was why he ever put it down. His fridge was mostly empty. His phone rang maybe once a week, usually a robocall promising him a free cruise if he gave up his social security number. He told one of them once, "Buddy, I don't even remember my social security number." But for all that, he managed. Kind of. He had his chair by the window, his old records, and a memory or two that still held strong, though they showed up late and left early, like unreliable friends. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like a slow unraveling, a soft, barely noticeable drifting away from the shore of himself. And he didn't tell anyone, but he was starting to worry, not about dying, but about disappearing before he even got the chance. And that's the space he lived in, day after day, until the night it rained. And that closet door creaked open, and everything started to change. It started with a drip, not some grand cinematic event, just a drip from the ceiling. One of those slow, rhythmic ones that could drive a man mad if he sat still long enough to listen. Bob noticed it around midnight, sitting in his recliner half asleep with the television flickering some late-night rerun. A spot of water had bloomed like a lazy jellyfish on the ceiling tile above the back hallway. At first, he just stared at it, thinking, maybe if I don't move, it'll fix itself. It didn't. So, grumbling like an old man's supposed to, he shuffled off toward the linen closet at the end of the hallway. That closet had barely been opened in over a decade. It was the Bermuda Triangle of his house, swallowed things whole and gave nothing back. You could toss in a flashlight and never see it again. Bob was after a bucket or a pan or anything that could catch a leak without looking like a man had given up on plumbing entirely. He opened the door and was instantly smacked in the face by the smell of old fabric, dust, and a faint whiff of whatever mothballs are made of. He always swore it was the same stuff they use in embalming fluid. He dug through the junk slowly. Coats from another century, board games with missing pieces, a humidifier that had grown its own ecosystem. Then, just as he was about to give up and let the floor take the rein, his hand brushed something odd. It wasn't cold like metal or soft like fabric. It was wood. And not just any wood. A panel. That panel didn't quite match the rest of the closet's back wall. It had a different grain, like it was pretending to fit in but hadn't been to rehearsal. Bob stared at it a moment, then, on impulse more than intention, tugged it. It gave way like a secret. Behind it wasn't much, just a shallow cavity. But nestled inside, covered in a dusty old flannel shirt, was something that made Bob's breath catch. A leather case, worn smooth on the edges, but unmistakable. He stared at it for a good 30 seconds before he even reached in. It wasn't just a case. It was his case. The one he carried through train stations, tucked under his arm like a limb. The one that had its own spot on every tour bus seat. The one that once got mistaken for a violin case, and he nearly swung it at a man in righteous musical offense. He reached out slowly and pulled it into the light. And just like that, something in the air changed, like the room was holding its breath. The latch gave a small squeak when he flipped it open. He'd expected rust, maybe rot, maybe even nothing at all. Sometimes memory plays tricks, right? Maybe it was just an old typewriter or one of those failed home improvement tools he always meant to return. But no, there it was, his trumpet. His beautiful, dented, golden old Martin committee. Goldie. He hadn't laid eyes on her in decades, but she looked almost the same. A little tarnished, sure. A slight ding near the bell, courtesy of a jazz festival in Detroit where someone had tried to swing dance on stage. Never again. But the moment his fingers touched that brass, it was like shaking hands with a part of himself he thought had long packed up and gone home. He sat down right there on the floor, legs creaking more than the closet door had, and lifted her gently from the case. His hands remembered before his brain did. Muscle memory kicked in like an old dog seeing its leash. His thumb slid into the first valve ring. His pinky curled under the hook. He ran his fingers along the lead pipe as if to say, "Hey, old girl, still breathing?" And then, without even meaning to, he brought it to his lips. The first note was awful. Not even a note. More like a goose with bronchitis. Bob laughed. A full, surprised belly laugh that echoed down the hallway like music. "Easy, easy," he muttered, as if she were a skittish horse. "We're both rusty, huh?" But then it came. That tune. Not "Take the A Train." Not "Autumn Leaves." No, this was his tune. One he made up back in 1961 on a street corner in Memphis. He and 3 other guys whose names had drifted out of his head like leaves in the wind. But that melody? Oh, it came back like a long-lost friend, low and slow, smoky and tender, the kind of tune you don't dance to. You just sit with it, like an old wound that never quite healed but stopped hurting so much. Bob played, softly at first. The notes stumbled, but they showed up, like guests who forgot the time but remembered to bring a bottle of wine. And in that moment, something clicked, not just in his fingers, in his soul. The fog didn't vanish. This wasn't some miracle movie cure, but it lifted just enough for Bob to remember something vital. He wasn't gone yet, not all the way, not while the music still lived in his hands. He sat there for who knows how long, playing until his lips ached and his fingers cramped. And when he finally lowered the horn, the house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. And neither did he. Outside, the rain kept falling. But inside, Bob had found a lighthouse in the middle of his storm, and it had 3 valves and a dented bell. It didn't have a name. That tune Bob played from the floor of his hallway closet wasn't something you'd find in any sheet music book. It wasn't listed under jazz standards, and no record label ever pressed it to vinyl. But it was his. 100% his. Not because he wrote it with ink, but because he breathed it into life once, a long time ago, on a Memphis sidewalk, sticky with heat and laughter. Funny thing is, Bob hadn't thought of that night in, 50, 60 years? But music doesn't use calendars. It lives in some back alley of your soul, waiting. And when he played that first phrase, just a 4-note phrase, soft and searching, it was like the whole night came rushing back. He could suddenly see the neon lights of that corner bar blinking half dead, could hear that distant train whistle and feel the sweat on his back as he leaned against a lamppost, horn in hand. There were 3 of them that night. One guy with a stand-up bass that looked twice his size, another with a snare strapped to his chest, and Bob, 23 and full of whatever it is young men are full of before the world really introduces itself. They didn't speak much, just nodded and started playing. Street jazz, raw, improvised, the kind that doesn't need rules, just ears and guts. Bob remembered the feeling more than the notes, that something was being said through the music that none of them could have said with words. Something true, something about heartbreak and hope coexisting in the same breath. Back in the present, sitting cross-legged on the old wooden floor, Bob played it again. Slower this time, more deliberate. His lips trembled a bit, not used to the pressure, but the sound. It had that same ache, that same truth. His memory didn't work like it used to. Some names were gone for good. Faces had melted into fog. But that song? It rose from somewhere deeper, someplace memory loss hadn't reached. And here's the part that'll sound crazy if you've never seen it happen. He started to smile, not just a polite grin either. I mean the kind of smile that comes from remembering who you were, from finding a part of yourself you thought was lost in the attic of your mind. Outside, the wind knocked at the windows. The house creaked in response. But inside, Bob had found something solid. And it didn't need a name. The thing about small towns is that news travels faster than cell signal. By the end of the week, word had gotten out. Old Man Bob found his horn. Someone said they heard music drifting out his window 2 nights in a row. Someone else swore they saw him tap his foot on the porch while holding it like he was back on stage at the Apollo. He wasn't. It was his porch, and he was eating a fig bar. But the grapevine had done its thing, which brings us to Dot. Dot ran the diner on Main, the one with the faded Eats sign and the sticky booths no one complained about. Dot was 72, sharp as a tack, and had been widowed last year. Her husband Frank had eaten 2 eggs and the same slice of dry toast every morning for 35 years, and then had the nerve to pass away on a Thursday, right before their cruise. Dot hadn't smiled much since, but when she heard about Bob's trumpet, something perked up in her. She'd known Bob for decades, not well, but well enough. He'd fixed her screen door once, played at her cousin's wedding, got drunk at her cousin's second wedding. So one afternoon, she just showed up at his door with a casserole and a question. "You ever think about playing again? In front of people?" Bob blinked at her like she'd asked him to run a marathon. "In front of who?" he asked. "People," she said, shrugging. "You know, town folks, truckers, the weird kid who eats pancakes with mustard. Doesn't have to be Carnegie Hall. Just the Tuesday night crowd at my place." Bob chuckled. "Lady, I forget what day Tuesday is." Dot winked. "Good thing I don't." That was the start of it. No fancy flyers, no stage lights, just a mic duct taped to a broom handle and a corner booth cleared of ketchup bottles. Bob showed up with his trumpet in a canvas tote bag and sat on a stool someone brought from home. Played 1 song, then 2. At first no one looked up, then someone set down their burger. Then the clatter of forks slowed, then quiet, and then came the claps, not wild concert-style applause, just real, slow, human claps. The kind that say we see you, and we remember you too. Every Tuesday after that, it became a thing. People didn't come just for the pie anymore. They came to listen. Bob didn't talk much those first few nights, but eventually he started telling little stories between songs. Nothing too heavy, just memories, little ones. Like the time he dropped his trumpet on a ferry and a stranger caught it before it fell into Lake Pontchartrain. Or the time his band got snowed in at a motel in Idaho and ended up recording an entire EP in the laundry room. People laughed. Dot rolled her eyes at the exaggerated parts. But no one cared if every word was true. What mattered was that Bob was present. He was alive, not just surviving. He still forgot things. He still woke up confused sometimes. But on Tuesday nights, with that horn in his hands and Dot pouring decaf, Bob remembered exactly who he was. And so did everyone else. By the 3rd or 4th Tuesday, Bob didn't need reminding anymore. He'd wake up that morning with a bit more certainty, a little more bounce in his steps. Well, shuffle. But still, there was something in him that clicked into place on Tuesdays, like his bones remembered something his mind couldn't quite say out loud. He'd shave, poorly. Dot joked once that he missed half his chin and looked like a man being slowly reclaimed by moss. He laughed, told her she could use a haircut herself, and somehow that exchange became their weekly warm-up. By 6:30 p.m., Bob would be seated in the corner of Dot's diner, trumpet resting in his lap like an old dog that had finally come home. It was never a concert. Never meant to be. Just 1 or 2 songs while folks finished their meatloaf and tried to remember whose turn it was to pick up the check. But what happened in that little diner? Well, you had to feel it to believe it. Bob didn't just play music. He unlocked memory, not just his own, everyone's. There was something about those old tunes, the way he poured himself into them, the way the horn cried on the high notes and sighed on the low ones. You'd see grown men stop mid-bite, forks halfway to their mouths, eyes misting over for reasons they couldn't explain. There was a young couple that came in every week, sitting in the same booth by the jukebox. After one song, the girl whispered to Dot, That's the song my granddad used to hum before his memory went. He'd tap it on the kitchen table. I didn't even know it was a real song. Dot just nodded. She'd heard variations of that line before. Bob wasn't just playing for himself anymore. His music became this invisible thread connecting people to moments they thought were lost. Their father's cologne, their mother's Sunday cooking, a summer night in '68 when they kissed someone under fireworks and believed in forever. Even Bob started talking more in between the music. Sometimes it was nonsense. Once he told everyone he met Louis Armstrong in a barber shop in Des Moines. Dot later whispered, "Bob's never even been to Iowa." And everyone laughed. But you know what? No one corrected him, because maybe in some version of his mind, it had happened. And honestly, who were they to say it didn't? Memory's funny like that. And rhythm? Rhythm is its own kind of anchor. When everything else starts to float away, it's the beat, the breath, the count, the sway that brings you back. Then came the night that would have broken a lesser man. It was early October, one of those Tuesdays when the wind bites a little harder and the air smells like distant bonfires. Bob showed up like usual, coat too thin for the season, trumpet case in hand, and a peppermint in his pocket for after the set. He sat on his stool, gave Dot her usual nod and set Goldie on his lap. Everything seemed fine. Until it wasn't. Bob opened the case, lifted the trumpet, brought it to his lips, and stopped. His fingers hovered over the valves, uncertain. He blinked. Once, twice. The room hushed. Folks put down their coffee. A spoon clinked gently into a bowl. Silence filled the air like heavy fog. Bob stared ahead, blank, lost. It was like watching a lighthouse suddenly go dark. Dot noticed it first. She didn't rush, didn't panic. Just walked over, gently laid a hand on his shoulder and leaned in. "You okay?" "Sugar?" she asked, low enough that only he could hear. He didn't answer, just looked at her with eyes that had clearly traveled somewhere else, somewhere far. I don't know the notes," he finally whispered. "They're gone." Dot didn't flinch. "Then don't play tonight," she whispered. "Just sit." And that's what he did. No music, no storytelling, just Bob, sitting in that corner like a man caught between two tides. Dot stayed beside him, didn't move. And slowly, one by one, the rest of the diner followed her lead. No one said a word, not even the weird kid who usually asked for extra mustard on his pancakes. For 20 long minutes, the diner held its breath, not in pity, but in presence, in respect, because this wasn't just about a man forgetting a song. It was about a man being seen, even when he couldn't perform. There's a kind of grace in that, the kind we don't talk about enough, when someone shows up and can't offer what they used to, can't make you laugh or sing or even remember your name, but you still sit with them. You're saying, you're not just here for what you can do. You're here because you're you. That's what they did for Bob. Nobody left early that night. Nobody fidgeted or checked their phones. A few folks sipped coffee like it was holy. One old man in the back, Carl, the retired plumber who never smiled, had tears in his eyes and didn't bother hiding them. Dot didn't speak the whole time. She just rested a hand on Bob's back and kept it there, steady as a heartbeat. The kind of quiet only a woman who's buried love and seen long winters knows how to carry. Eventually, Bob looked around, eyes a little clearer now. He saw the room, really saw it. Those familiar faces, that battered linoleum floor, the coffee machine sputtering like it had asthma. And he realized something that made his throat catch. They were still there. Even when the music wasn't. Even when he wasn't all there. That night, he didn't play a single note. But when he stood up to leave, the whole diner clapped. Not loud, not wild, just slow, soft, real. And Bob, old as he was, bowed just slightly, smiled with a corner of his mouth and whispered, "Thank you." Dot walked him home that night. Didn't offer advice. Didn't try to cheer him up. Just walked beside him like memory itself, quiet and steady. And Bob, feeling the October wind sneak under his collar, said something neither of them forgot. "I thought I had to play to matter. But maybe just showing up's enough sometimes." Dot just squeezed his arm and nodded. Because it was. About a week after the night Bob couldn't play, something showed up in his mailbox. Now, you have to understand, Bob didn't get much mail. Not anymore. Most of it was junk or bills for things he didn't remember subscribing to. He got a newsletter from the plumbing supply store once a month, and he didn't even own a wrench. So when he found a small envelope tucked between a gas bill and a flyer offering him free cremation consultation, it caught his eye. No return address, just his name, handwritten, slanted cursive that looked like it belonged to someone who still believed in fountain pens and thank you notes. He brought it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at it for a while before opening it, like it might dissolve if he rushed it. Then, with fingers that trembled more than they used to, he slid a letter out from inside. It read, "Dear Mr. Bob, my grandpa used to have Alzheimer's. He played harmonica, but by the end, he couldn't remember how. Or me. I was 8 the last time he knew who I was. Now I'm 15. Every Tuesday night, I sit at Dots with my mom and listen to you play. The first time, I didn't know why I felt like crying. Then I realized. I felt like I had my grandpa back for a few minutes. It's not just your music. It's you. You remember something for people who can't anymore. Thank you for coming back. Your fan, Liam." Bob read the letter 3 times. Then he sat real still for a long while. And then, like the body knows what to do when the heart's too full, he slowly got up, walked to the living room, and picked up Goldie. Didn't play. Just held her. Not because he felt strong, but because he knew now he still mattered. Not because of what he remembered, but because he showed up. That note didn't magically heal him. It didn't stitch his memory back together or stop the days from blurring. But it did something better. It reminded him that he was still part of someone else's story, even if his own had smudged in places. You know, Bob still forgets things. Still puts the remote in the fridge and calls the neighbor's cat by his late wife's name, Marcy. The cat doesn't seem to mind. In fact, it comes around more now. But there's something different in the way Bob moves through his days now. He still lives alone. Still drinks his coffee too hot. Still doesn't know where his reading glasses are, though he's convinced they're involved in some kind of secret rebellion. But the man knows who he is again. Not all the time, but often enough. He's the guy who used to tour juke joints and jazz halls. The guy who kissed his wife during a trumpet solo in '67 and never quite hit that note the same again. The guy who forgot a melody and was loved anyway. And you know what? That's what this whole thing's about, isn't it? Not the trumpet, not the diner, not even the memory loss. It's about the part that remains when everything else falls away. The soul of a man, the rhythm in his chest, the note he was born to play, even if it sometimes comes out sideways now. Living alone? That's not the hard part. People do that every day and figure it out. You get used to silence. You make friends with shadows. You learn how to cook 1 egg instead of 2, and you only talk back to the television on Sundays. But forgetting who you are? That's the part that sneaks up on you. That's the storm no one teaches you how to navigate. And that's why this story matters. Because somewhere in the middle of a leaky ceiling and a dusty closet, Bob found something that memory loss couldn't take. The music still lived in him, and it brought him back, 1 note at a time. So if this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you love, don't keep it to yourself. Give it a like, hit that subscribe button, and share this video with someone who might need a little hope today. You never know whose memory it might help bring back.